Alrighty, so this is not a video topic I planned on doing anytime soon, but let's go ahead and talk about the vandalization of public property. Alrighty guys, as usual, let's get into the fan art and then move into the topic at hand. So, first up on the list is from Dragonlord 2006, and it's a furry Suris. Then we have a creepy Suris requiring foreskin by PS Toxic, and then a sketch by Skyward Hearts. As usual, thank you all for your submissions, and I hope you're strapped in for a more ranty video than usual. The topic of the day is hostile architecture, and why there might actually be a moral imperative to certain types of vandalism where this stuff is involved. I'm not saying get yourself in trouble, but I am saying removal of this type of architecture by any means necessary, whether that be by delegation or otherwise, might be a moral imperative. So let's talk about what hostile architecture is real quick before we talk about why it needs to be removed. Hostile architecture is an intentional design strategy that uses elements of the built environment to guide or restrict behavior in urban space as a form of crime prevention or order maintenance. It often targets people who use or rely on a public space more than others, like people who are homeless or youth, by restricting the behaviors they engage in. You can also find articles on this if you look up defensive architecture, hostile design, unpleasant design, or exclusionary design. One of the most common types of hostile architecture are any variant of homelessness spikes, as you can see on screen here. One of these images are a set of bolts installed in the front of steps to discourage sitting and sleeping, and the other one are a set of spikes that are placed under bridges in order to prevent homeless people from seeking shelter during the rain. Now, while I recognize there's a bit of an argument you can have here over what should be done with homeless people, over what funding should go into and how housing projects should be managed, and whether or not housing is a human right, which I believe it is. Shelter is literally at the very bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Anywho, while I understand that those arguments can be had, at no point in that argument should kicking the homeless when they're down factor into the conversation. Face it, homeless people exist. There's no getting around it. So why would you build architecture specifically designed to prevent homeless people from being able to seek shelter? But it doesn't have to be quite as obvious as spikes on the ground. As seen on screen here are a set of bike racks that were installed in Seattle, and these bike racks were installed in a place that barely ever received any bicycle traffic. But what it did receive was a decent subset of homeless people that would try to use the awning to set up tents so that they could survive the harsh weather. Let me reiterate, there really wasn't that much bicycle traffic in this area, and people didn't regularly park their bicycles for there to be a need for these racks. And even if you wanted to make the case that there is a need for these racks in some way, shape, or form, you only really need one or two of them. You don't need an entire row. And in fact, later, spokesperson Karen Westing confirmed that the bike racks were used as a part of a strategy for lessening the hazards of unsheltered living by creating a space for different active public use. But here's the thing. Things like this don't actually lessen the hazards of unsheltered living. They increase them by removing your ability to actually find refuge in a sheltered zone. There's other forms of hostile architecture that include sloped windowsills to prevent people from sitting, or benches with armrests positioned to stop people from lying on them. Sometimes they can be benches like the ones I'll show on screen right now, but sometimes, much like with the bicycle racks, it's a little more insidious, where the hostile architecture seems to be serving a completely different purpose than what it's actually there to do. For the bicycle racks, it was, well, for bicycles that really weren't trafficking the area to prevent people from seeking shelter, but for some park benches, it's as simple as putting a middle bar on the bench so that it's impossible for somebody to lay down, as seen here. In fact, in New Zealand, one of my partners had a situation where these benches were being modified to have these middle bars. The argument the city tried to give was that they were there so that people who were disabled would be able to have something to hold on to when trying to get themselves off the bench. But in reality, all it did was make it to where people couldn't lay down on a bench that people were otherwise able to get up from anyways. People who already had canes or walkers didn't have much issue getting off of the bench. And it's not just homeless people that were hurt by benches like these. People who are disabled and have disabilities such as chronic fatigue syndrome or various forms of POTS may find themselves in a situation where they have to pass out in public. But with these bars installed on the bench, there is no safe place to do so, meaning that the only option is the cold hard ground. And it's not like they can try to relocate to a different place. These disabilities can flare up at random occasions. Having a bench available for this purpose would be incredibly helpful for people suffering from these types of disabilities. And yet, it is disabilities that are used as an excuse to bring out this type of hostile architecture. So whether the reason given is to help a subset of the population or otherwise, hostile architecture is becoming more and more common, and it's a real issue. As the wage gap between poverty and the middle class increases here in the United States, or hell, the middle class slowly disappears, we're going to see more and more homeless people. But the more of this hostile architecture that is enacted, the more hostile our environment is going to be towards these homeless people. And I'm sure there's a subset of my audience that is going to try to argue that by having architecture that is there so that they can sleep and otherwise rest, we're encouraging people to be homeless. My response to that would be, you are an idiot. And that is the most idiotic thing I have heard all day. I literally heard it today on Twitter. Putting a park bench somewhere where it is convenient and usable by the public does not encourage homelessness. The homelessness happens one way or another. People don't just decide, oh yes, there are park benches, so I will be homeless and it will be wonderful. Very few people want to be homeless. Most people want shelter. And it seems really strange to me that there's a bootstrap-style ideology that argues that by having this hostile architecture, we will be encouraging homeless people to seek a better life. They already had incentive to seek a better life. They're freaking homeless. All you're doing by setting up architecture like this is kicking people who already have a crappy lot in life while they're down. That doesn't encourage someone to get better. That's a demotivator. So now that we've talked about what hostile architecture is, let's get into its background. The actual term is a bit recent, but civil engineering to achieve social engineering isn't exactly a new thing. In the 19th century, we had things called urine deflectors. These were designed to prevent people from being able to urinate outside houses, and while this is a fairly benign example and can be seen as somewhat harmless, since there are other places one can urinate pretty easily in most areas, the design philosophy behind architecture like this has been used to enable crime prevention through environmental design. Let's all bear in mind, though, that the definition of a crime differs from society to society and even from age to age. Freeing a slave was once a crime. The three tenets of crime prevention through environmental design are natural surveillance, natural access control, and territorial enforcement. I'll be providing an article in the description that goes into a little more detail, but I'll go ahead and cover a few good points in it. One of the key features of hostile design is that when you're designed against it, you know it. But when other people see it, they can't realize it. But you will. The message is clear. You're not a member of the public. Or at least, not the public that's welcome here. You can't tell that that middle bar on the park bench is there specifically to stop a homeless person from sleeping there until you're a homeless person in need of a rest. You can't tell that the bicycle racks that have been placed in front of your apartment are there to stop homeless people from resting there unless you were a homeless person whose encampment had to be moved because of this. So what does this hostile architecture actually accomplish? Well, it turns public spaces into more pseudo-public spaces, where the public at large can enjoy certain facilities, but there's a certain section of the public that are not allowed them. It's like a more subtle version of segregation. If we can subtly and civilly engineer people to not be able to access certain spaces, these type of spaces end up becoming exclusive to a subset of the population. Another way to oppress minority groups, whether they be minority by race in the case of segregation, or minority by economic status in the case of hostile architecture. The sociologist Robert Park once wrote, "In making the city, we make ourselves." That is to say, the architecture of our society is a reflection of the people who dwell within it. So ultimately, one has to wonder, what type of self-conception does society have if the city is covered in metal spikes, illuminated by blue lights, and buzzing with high frequencies? An article I'll be providing in the description by Miria Adler-Gillis argues that a society that is built like this must be paranoid, anxious, and hostile by design. A society is built by its public, but when that society is turned against its public, what type of society have we actually constructed? What kind of world do we live in when the world that we shape around ourselves is ourselves? Homeless people aren't different from you. They are you. While there are certain types of crime prevention that this type of architecture can be useful for and that are good, like the previously shown flint cone that was used to prevent urination on the side of a house, there are far too many examples of hostile architecture being used for, quite frankly, inhumane purposes. So what do? What's the correct thing to do in situations like this? Well, I'm not advocating for vandalization of public property per se, but As you can see on screen here, some people have taken to tagging architecture like this with design crime stickers in an attempt to raise public awareness. Others have taken to outright destruction of this type of property, taking a cutter to the inner bar of park benches, for examples. I'm not outright saying that you should be destroying public property. A lot of the fight where many types of architecture like this are concerned can be handled by getting involved in the politics of your city, being a public advocate or supporting those who are willing to be public advocates. But the most important thing to remember in all of this is that this isn't designed for a subset of the population you don't belong to. You are the population. When hostile architecture is enacted in your vicinity, that's an attack on you, because all it takes is your economic status changing for you to be in the minority that is affected by it. We should be working to build a society that has a feather fall for people who find themselves on hard times like this, not a society that only has a bed of spikes for when you hit rock bottom. This is one of those videos that I think people should get involved in the conversation with, so please, if you enjoyed it or if you have criticism, let me know in the comment section below. If you want to raise awareness for this type of issue, then please share this video out with people who you think need to hear this message. If you know your local city politicians have done something like this and voted for it, spam my video at them, because this isn't something that anybody should stand for. Let's try to build a society that is for its people, not one that isolates people who it can special plead that it's allowed to be against. And as always, everyone, insert end a video tagline here.